Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Podcast powered by First National. I'm Aaron Cameron. With me, of course, Adam Płatek. Recording here live at the Vancouver Real Estate Forum as part of our video speaker series. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Appraisal Institute of Canada, Revesco Properties Trust, and Remax Commercial. Our guest today is a woman by the name of Anne McMullin, who is the president and CEO of the Urban Development Institute here in British Columbia.
Yes, that's great.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for coming on.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
So we're going to maybe plead a tiny bit of ignorance because UDI has a very large presence here. And of course, we're based out of Ontario. So we're going to ask you to share your real estate story, get into the UDI story, but maybe we'll spend a little more time on what UDI is than we normally would on one of these interviews, just for that reason that we got to educate ourselves here in the process.
Right. So you want me the story of how I got into real estate? Well, just real quick. I mean, I am a public policy advocacy expert, I would say. I've worked in the resource sector in British Columbia, in forestry, in logistics, port, salmon. And so I've worked very much in business development. And about 12 years ago, the Urban Development Institute came to me and said, well, through a search process, would you take on the role of the president and CEO? The previous person had been in the job for about 30 years. And that was kind of as simple as it was. Like I said, I've been working in logistics, mostly in the port industry. I had worked with the port authorities to amalgamate the 3 port authorities into one, and also to change the Canada Marine Act to be able for port authorities to be able to borrow money so that they could expand the container terminals here and build a new container terminal out in Roberts Bank, out in the community of Delta. And that was a massively significant thing that really changed Vancouver and changed how we export and import goods. And so it was really after that I'd been doing some work on the North Shore as well that they came to me and said, would you take on this role? And I'm like, well, I always like to go sort of jump into the fry pans where there is industries where things are in perhaps a tough time or a controversial time, that I like to go in and try to settle things down and build bridges and create an environment for an industry to flourish. Like I said, I would say so. Yeah. So I worked in the forest industry during the whole, maybe date me, but the whole war in the woods in Clayoquot Sound, working with the government and the forest industry to bring in a whole new set of rules and regulations. And same thing working with here in British Columbia. We just brought in partnership with the province some pieces of legislation, which is the biggest change in housing policy really in about 30 years. So it's been significant, and it's tough bringing it in. This next year or so is going to be very difficult as the new legislation works its way through the municipalities, but it's the kind of work that had to be done. So it's pretty monumental.
What would you describe as monumental on the UDI front? Let's get into what UDI is.
Yeah, so the Urban Development Institute is an organization that represents the commercial, residential, and industrial developers in British Columbia. They are British Columbia based, but they operate all across Canada. So they're the biggest developers in the province and often in the country. And we also have associate members. So anybody's in the business of development, like accounting firms, engineering firms, architects, and it's
lenders.
Lenders, absolutely. Martin Thibodeau, who is the president of RBC for Western Canada, is on our board. Hawk AC, who's the head of KPMG Real Estate, is on our board. So they're based here, but representing the industry and representing, I suppose, as well as the country. So it represents, we have, I think, 950 corporate members, which represents probably about 250,000 employees around British Columbia. I have an office here in Vancouver, and we have an office in Kelowna and also in Victoria. So, and we have, I say there's, I think, 22 employees, but I have about 350 volunteers. So meaning people who work in the industry sit on our committees to work through policy and regulation and work with communities, or work with municipalities, I should say, to develop, like I said, policy and regulation for the real estate industry. So people are very active, very engaged, and it's a very, very strong organization. Of all the industries I've worked in, I've never seen anything that's quite as unique as UDI, where the CEOs are on the board and the CEOs are at the committee meetings and the CEOs are working with government, directly with the premier or with the housing minister, to try to bring in regulation and policy so that we can build the housing that we need.
How receptive have governments been? I mean, you've been in this position for 12 years. Has it changed over time?
Absolutely. I think that really changed when who's the current premier, David Eby, was named housing minister about 3 years ago. And he recognized, obviously, that we're in a housing crisis, and certainly the previous government had not been successful in dealing with it. And he came to me, actually, and said, I'm now the new housing minister and we've got to build housing and you guys build housing. We may not trust each other, but we've got to work together. And those first few...
Why don't you trust us?
Yeah, well, it's true. There's a lot of, well, yeah, it was a difficult relationship.
It's like being a fight with your sibling, but you're not mad at all. It's like, I don't understand why there's...
Yeah, traditionally it goes back to, I would say that the industry is free enterprise and the NDP government is seen as not. But, for all of the criticism on either side, I think our industry would say that this premier now is one of the most educated premiers on housing that we've ever had. And I think that's largely, because he's taken the time and working with the industry and listening and really figuring out what the issues are and what the problem is.
Well, affordability is a top 3 issue for every politician at every level of government straight across the country. And let's ignore the reason that is being, of course, affordability has gotten worse. But has that helped your, advocacy position, the fact that it's been reprioritized to the top of the list for virtually every politician?
Well, I like to take credit for it because we, back when I started at UDI more than 12 years ago, we kept saying the issue is supply. It's supply, it's supply, it's supply. And people were criticizing us. They would call us, they would sort of mimic us and, about, oh, you just want more supply, the greedy developer, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's supply, supply is stupid. And it took a long time, but it took about 7 or 8 years, 9 years maybe, for people to actually go, oh, we have a supply problem. Let's blame the foreign buyer. Let's blame the speculator. Let's add taxes here. Let's create all these demand side measures. And we kept saying to them, you create more demand side measures, you bring in rent control, you're going to create a bigger problem. And then when they realize that, oh, it's not working, then finally there's that recognition. And, I don't want to sound too parochial, but in Vancouver, people were reluctant and it was almost a bad word to say supply. Now you actually hear news anchors and reporters saying we have a supply problem in Vancouver or in British Columbia. And it's satisfying. We would say our job is not to be popular. Our job is to be right. And that's, we maintain that. And it is a supply problem. And you can argue about why, but that is our problem and we need to address it. And the only reason you address a supply problem is to create more supply. And that's, I guess you could argue that yes, the fact that the province and the feds are finally recognizing it took the federal government a long time. But politics has, pushed them, I suppose, in that direction, certainly at the federal level. And I guess it did at the provincial level as well. But also, I think this premier took a lot of heat in the first couple of years as the housing minister about being vocal about needing supply. So
I just met you, Anne, but I know that I can tell you're a very, very patient person. and I know that. I know that,
my daughter.
I know that only because, you are obviously dealing predominantly with politicians who rotate through, who have, unfortunately at times, motivations that don't necessarily align with reality, simply because they're looking to get votes and maintain their position wherever they are. And you're dealing with all levels of government, so you're dealing with all different egos. And I don't mean the bad egos, but just
politicians,
just
elected officials, and the bureaucracies. Yeah.
Right. And so, you have been in this role for 12 years. It's clearly not the same people that are at the municipal levels or in the supporting roles. How do you keep going back and having to re-educate? How do you approach that for yourself to kind of keep getting back saying, no, it is a supply. Remember, we've had this conversation before. Your predecessor, who was sitting here 2 weeks ago, they were here. Let's keep moving. Right? Like I feel like there's a lot of false starts, perhaps.
You think of it as anything. The development company are in it for the long term, whether it's multi-generational or you're in it for 30 years. And largely, you have to be doing the same things. Yes, things change. But I think you have to recognize that people's minds, it's hard to change people's minds and it takes time. You say, you tell people 3 things and they'll finally remember it. But you're darn dealing with the changing politicians, but you're also dealing with communities and people who don't want their communities to change. We're dealing with a city that I grew up in that has changed incredibly. I love the change. Not everybody likes change. So it's that understanding of where people are coming from. It's understanding where politicians are coming from, what their needs are, and as well with the community. So I guess it's patience, but it's just a realization, unfortunately. I guess that these things do take time, and we're very clear on what we're trying to achieve through increasing supply and how we do that, and it's, building around transit-oriented development, that zoning is not just single family homes, that we need to make processing times, improve the processing time, so get homes built more quickly, and that you can't tax your way to affordability. So we've always got to be looking at reducing costs. So those are and then the fifth one is, I guess, is increasing our rental supply, because that's when we hadn't done rental really since, I guess, CMHC the federal government got out of the rental business 30 or 40 years ago. So those 5 things is you've just got to, you're clear on what those 5 things are, and they don't change, and they probably won't change for 20 years. They probably won't change for 30 years. So yeah, is it patience, or it's patience and a realization that it takes a long time to educate a lot of people. And yes, politicians perhaps come and go. The bureaucracy largely doesn't. But yeah, I mean, it is a lot of work. And that's why I say we have so many people who are in the industry who essentially volunteer to work with and help to educate the 25 or 26 municipalities that are just here in the Lower Mainland, let alone the ones in the Okanagan or the islands. So yeah, I mean, someone said to me, one of my board members, and I think, I don't know, it was a few years ago, sort of getting down about it, and he said, you're not allowed to be cynical. You're the one who has to be optimistic. We can be cynical, but you're not hired to be cynical. I'm like, okay, you're right. And I'm not a cynical person, but sometimes sometimes sure, as I used to say, my dad had a phrase, never let the who get you down, and you just don't let it get you down. Yeah, I think we are. Like I said, the legislation.
No other answer.
Exactly. That's right. That's what I tell them on my annual review. And making progress? Absolutely. How tough is it out there? Sometimes I think, in the time I've been here, things have gotten more difficult, but things have gotten more difficult, just in general, I think.
The supply is way up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not up nearly enough. I mean,
Though that's just it, because our immigration has gone up way more than what was initially anticipated. When I started, it was 35,000 people a year into Metro, and now it's like 120. So we have not kept up. Not only have we not kept up with sort of that 35,000 a year, not even kept up with the exponential growth that we've seen in immigration. So it all sometimes seems so simple that, of course, you tie your immigration targets to your housing targets, and you give the municipalities and the provinces the money to build the schools and the hospital that corresponds with those numbers. But I'm not going to run for office. I can just see the picture. That's all.
why don't you run for office?
Oh, no, thank you. I think hopefully I can be more effective doing what I'm doing.
Of the various, levers you try and pull on to relieve some of the anti-development pressures, what do you think is the cleanest path to increasing supply, to improving the development landscape, in the near term? Well,
the major pieces of legislation are called Bill 44, 46, and 47, and they're nicely knitted together. One of those is around pre-zoning. So the first one is what they're basically saying is municipalities now have to come up with an official community plan. They used to have to do that, but they wouldn't update it for 20 years. So now they've got to update it every 2 to 4 years, and it has to be approved by the provincial government. And with that OCP, then that land is supposed to be then pre-zoned, and then they develop with that pre-zone their housing targets. And then they have to meet the housing targets that the province approves. So then we're not going through this massive rezoning process, and every single project is different. You're actually zoning and planning properly, coming up with that official community plan. It is now pre-zoned. We now know where the housing is going to go, and we know how much. And then the public and the residents of the communities can decide, say, what that looks like or where it goes within the municipality. But they don't get to say no. You've now been legislated a target of how many housing units you're supposed to be building in your community. And you've also come up with a plan that is now mandated through legislation that outlines what that's going to look like. But that's going to take a year to 18 months to start working it through its system. So unfortunately, we're still at least 10 years away before, we even start to make a dent in the housing crisis, just because even if you go through this process with the new legislation that's really in place in 18 months, and then you do the approvals, and then it takes 2 to 3 years to build, we're still 6 or 7 years away. And that's sometimes a little bit depressing, but we had no choice except to completely turn the whole approval process upside down. And some people say we took away the powers from the municipalities, and you could argue that yes, but I think the municipalities had too much discretion in a way, rather than saying, okay, here are the federal housing targets, here are the number of or immigration targets, here are the number of people that are moving to British Columbia. Okay, municipalities, this is how we house them. And then you have to live up to that. You can't say no, because they often say, well, we're here to defend existing residents. And I said, well, hang on a second. There's 300,000 people moving here every year. Do we not have a responsibility to those people too? They're voters. So anyway, that's
So this
seems simple to me.
does this eliminate NIMBYism?
Well, I don't think anything eliminate, but it hopefully gives the municipalities the tools to make decisions that won't put them out of office.
Yeah. And being beholden to the current residents.
Yeah, and still saying to residents, we have a responsibility that we need to take in this many residents each year, and we're going to plan for that. And what does that look like in our municipality? And what do we need in terms of amenities, schools, pools, parks, parking, whatever it may be? But, we can't be saying no to density around transit stations that everybody in this province, in fact, everyone in this country has paid for, multi-million-dollar train stations or transit lines, and then people don't want to build around them. That's your money and my money, and we don't just get to be able to walk up from our single family home to a multi-million-dollar train station.
2 minutes to the local train. Yeah. It's
So if you think of it that way. And so, yeah, I think that there is a recognition that we do need to create more supply. And there's always the pushback as well. People don't want below market housing in the neighborhood, but that's now changing too. I think they recognize that maybe below market housing is for their kids. It's not for,
The drug addicts down the street.
Yeah. And those people need to be housed too. But I just, so it's
below market can still be fairly expensive.
Well, we've been talking about affordability, right? There's layers of affordability. Like there's deep affordable, which is really subsidized housing, which is not what we're talking about. We're just talking about units that our children can afford, right?
Yeah, and I talk about availability. Like we can talk about affordability all we want, but we don't even have availability. So, you want to try to rent something, even if it's difficult. Even if somebody had the money, it's hard to find something.
In the Lower Mainland, with so many municipalities, how do you manage your time going all the way through? There's so many councillors, all the fiefdoms.
Well, like I said, we stick to our 5 key. What are our 5 key issues we're trying to achieve? And if it doesn't meet those, and I said to my staff the other day, actually, if it's not creating housing or inhibiting housing, we're not working on it. So when we go to municipalities and they're coming up with new policies, okay, you know what? We're not going to support that. It's inhibiting the supply of housing. So change it. So, I don't mean to be that glib, but that is our litmus test. And, we have our liaison committees. And like I said, most of our municipalities, we have committees where we're working with the municipality. We meet with them once a month or once every couple of months. And it's really our volunteers. It's really people that in our industry, the developers that are sitting around the table. And we as staff, as UDI, manage those, take the information, synthesize it, put forward recommendations, and work very, very closely with our executive and our board. Everybody is so engaged. And it's, obvious, I guess for obvious reasons, but it is, it's actually really, I was going to say it's fun. People say, what do you do? I love my job. What do you work on? Policy. And they're like, what? That's fun. It is. Because you think you're making a difference. And it's interesting.
So are you excited that, this, not that excited is maybe the wrong word, but this housing crisis has elevated this discussion and this need for action to all levels of government. And you actually have some form of alignment now with federal policy, provincial policy, municipal policy, all is starting to recognize the supply is the issue. They need to work with the private sector to figure this out. Like you're actually now feeling, probably in the 12 years you've been at the job, the most amount of momentum you've ever had.
Isn't that funny? I do, but it almost feels overwhelming or almost sort of exhausting. We got there. Okay, now we got to implement it. But yeah, it is. I have to temper people's enthusiasm sometimes because it's still going to take time, and that's the last thing a developer wants to hear. They're let's go. They're risk takers. Yes, exactly. So, but yeah, of course, it is. It's exciting. It's satisfying, but it's still really difficult. Like it's not, still get pushed back. But yeah, I guess my answer is, I'm excited about new legislation. Is that for a dinner time conversation? Yeah.
The last handful of years, we've seen some, positive changes, whether you want to call that the GST removal or rental protection fund here in BC, or the implementation of MLI Select, to build rental housing. Which policy change the last handful of years do you think was the most impactful or will be soon?
Well, I do think that the provincial legislation, which was the 44, 46, 47, which is around transit-oriented development, which is around zoning, and also how development is the sort of what we call the financing not the financing of development, but how the funds are collected through the development process, the amenity contribution cost. So those three things are probably the most fundamental changes.
That's the official development plan, the ODP
Yeah,
or something?
well, yeah. So those are the three pieces of legislation the provincial government brought in last fall, which is to sort of create that OCP, the housing targets, and then the mandating that pre-zoning, and to build. They can't decline applications for up to 20 stories around transit. So those are the biggest ones. And like I said, they've just been announced, and the regulation, the frameworks are still being rolled out. So the time will tell, as we say. But those were massively significant.
When's the next provincial election?
October.
Oh, soon. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it baked? Is that legislation baked?
Oh yeah, it's been passed. Yeah,
Okay.
it's been passed. Now the only thing that is not baked is what we call the framework, or the regulatory framework, and that's being rolled out now, and that's a lot of work that.
So
that
you're confident, regardless of what happens in October, this will continue forward.
Oh yes, but the rollout is and will be difficult because it's a complete change for the municipalities, and I recognize that. So you're doing your job one way, and then the legislation changed. Now you're going to do it a completely different way. Yet you've still got to be working on things while you're bringing in the new changes. So we're trying to help the municipalities. Okay, how can we get through this? Also trying to help with the province. Okay, here's where it works. Here's what it doesn't work. So it is going to take 12 to 18 months to really have this figured out. And again, these things are always living documents. But yeah, I mean, the GST removal was huge. Our concern is if we don't have a proper, what I call density bonus, or the amenity contributions formula, then that just gets clawed back by the municipalities through increasing in fees and things like that. So, but that was hugely significant. Absolutely. Yeah, so there's been a lot.
Not to forget our friends in the industrial and commercial space.
Well, yeah, we're talking mostly about res.
Let's go there. What are the hot topics for the developers that are participating in those assets?
Well, I think industrial is still doing well. It's probably not the same as it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it's still very much a strong asset. There's not a lot of land in British Columbia that's available, certainly in the Lower Mainland. We've got the ocean, the mountains, the ALR, the U.S. border, the Fraser River, and this is a hub. This is a port city. And so industrial land is still very much a very, very strong asset, and I don't see that changing. There's still difficulties as well as trying to develop industrial land like there is with residential. If we had more industrial land, that would be great. I think, I think we've got industrial land where we could do some swapping, but there are strong policies in place around swapping industrial land, which doesn't make sense. But well, no, it's like the ILR, like almost an industrial land reserve. Like the region, Metro Vancouver, came up with a policy quite a number of years ago that you're not allowed to convert industrial land to residential. And we say we get that, but what if there's industrial land in areas that would be better served for residential, such around transit stations, and that there's areas that are residential, that maybe out in the valley or out more in the suburbs, that would be better served as industrial. So we need to be more flexible because land and our uses and our technology, all these things change. So we just need to be more nimble and more flexible. But maybe that's an oxymoron. I don't know.
Like notionally, it makes sense. You can't chew up all the employment land with housing, then there's no employment.
Right.
One of the bases of the economy, but
have a look at your land base. What's the highest and best use? How is it being used? So yes, we need industrial land, but maybe where it's zoned industrial is not the best place. Well, it goes way back. Yeah, exactly. Same with the ALR. I understand the value of the ALR, but how is it being used? So I'm not saying you convert it, take away, but I just think a better examination of it. That's all. Yeah. And then with office, there's been a lot of talk about the office as, coming out of COVID. In Vancouver, though, our office utilization is probably, I think it's best in North America. There's a 10% vacancy rate in office. Will there be a new office building built in the next 2 years? Probably not. So yeah, I mean, it's as a value, as an asset, that's for the investors, and it's but in terms of building new office space, they talk to about the conversion of office space to residential and more of it a multi-use. I don't think that, certainly what our understanding is here, it doesn't work.
Well, I think we identified it. They talk about it, but not very many people are actually doing it.
No, I mean, in Calgary, I guess they're doing it, but you know, with the new building code and how what offices or the design of offices, I mean, it would take an enormous amount. The cost would just be, cost prohibitive. So, and like I said, we've got fairly good utilization of our office. And I think that's going to change as well. Who knows what it's going to look like, but.
Well, even then the fairly good utilization of the office would be a detriment to conversion because it helps support the values. And of course your sort of land costs
retail.
going in
Yeah,
higher.
yeah.
You'd want, less utilization in order to then pencil out a conversion, but I digress.
Yeah, and could you do more of, residential at the top and office at the bottom and go higher? I mean, there's a few, we're looking one right now that we have a few of those downtown. So, that's an opportunity to get, but also there are other areas where you still can go high and build around transit. So, yeah. I mean, downtown Vancouver, I think they've done a pretty good job. But what I find is when you drive around or fly over Metro Vancouver, we've got these sort of flat and then zoom, rather than creating a, an entire kind of community. It's this sort of, someone says like little forest or little asparagus things that stick up at transit stations. So there's 3 or 4 or 5, maybe even 7 sort of cities in the Lower Mainland, but not a concentration sort of culture. And that's where you lose a bit, I think, because you can only afford so many museums and art galleries and culture. And when it's not centralized, then you lose that. Then you don't have those opportunities. I mean, things are being centralized in Vancouver, but this whole notion of creating all these urban centers is a great idea, so you're not moving around as much, but then you lose out on that centralization of culture.
We're running out of time. I mean, I think I know the answer if I asked you what were you most excited for, in the next coming months. Maybe if you just want to have any final thoughts or closing thoughts, or just,
The vision for the next 5 years.
Exactly.
Well, again, I keep repeating myself, I guess, but it's, the implementing those major pieces of legislation and then working with the federal government there's that understanding that infrastructure funding must be tied to immigration targets, and that things like, right now our Schools Act or our Hospital Act, you can't build a school unless the kids are there. So then everybody moves into this community, then the kids are there, then you build the school. Well, that's ridiculous, right? So those are the sort of things we'd like to see changed. As we now have the legislation, we're allowed to start building. Okay, now part of those plans need to include the other pieces of infrastructure. I could go on and on about the deficiencies of BC Hydro. Again, you can't increase the power in an area until the people are there. Well, you need the power there before the people get there. But those are things, they're old pieces of legislation that need to change. So, but I feel positive that there's that recognition and understanding of the changes that are needed. And so we just got to keep plugging away at it.
Well, you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear the change that's occurred and the change that's coming, and clearly still passionate about it.
Yeah.
12 years later.
Yeah, and I grew up here.
Not
My
cynical.
parents are from here, exactly, and it's home, and you want to be a part of it. And I, like I said, I've seen this place when I was born here. There's less than 1 million people in this region. And it's changed so much, and I think it's fantastic.
Well, you're in the thick of it.
I'm in the thick of it. That's right. Do you want to talk about hockey or the weather? Yeah.
No, real estate. Well, I always joke. Real estate's like that, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has an opinion on real estate.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Informa for hosting us here at the Vancouver Real Estate Forum. Thanks to our sponsors of the speaker video series, the Appraisal Institute of Canada, Revesco Properties Trust, and Remax Commercial. And of course, thanks to First National for powering the podcast. Thanks, Anne. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. It's been fun.